Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another class of web and mobile systems. So in the previous class, we have basically had an overview with respect to setting up, configuring, and then working with Tailwind CSS, right? Essentially, the major thing that we learned is that it is a CSS framework, which is based on class utilities. So what it does is instead of having to write our own CSS from scratch, what we can essentially achieve is we can utilize these class names that Tailwind CSS has defined for us, and then we can kind of include that as part of HTML attribute with the class attribute, and then use those class names in order to apply all our CSS style names, right? So this is kind of beneficial in the sense that we don't have to worry about having to write all of the CSS syntax from scratch that we had learned basically when we were covering about fundamental CSS, right? So it speeds up the process of development. It is kind of ad hoc and dynamic in nature, so that you don't have to worry about creating a CSS file and then having to write the entirety of the CSS that you want to apply to your website or web application. You can just start off with an HTML file and then basically start adding all your different CSS classes that you want to kind of apply to your web design, right? So the only thing that you have to keep in mind, again, and I keep on repeating this, is that Tailwind CSS is not an alternative to the basic CSS. You still need to know what basic CSS is, so that you can actually kind of relate to the different class utilities that are available in Tailwind CSS and have a knowledge of what they kind of refer to, right? There are also certain questions that you should have at this point after looking at Tailwind CSS and how it works, right? Is that how is this any different from inline styling in CSS itself, right? So if you remember here, what we are doing is, of course, we are doing an external CSS linking for the output.css file that is generated after we compile the Tailwind directives that we get from its documentation and stuff like that. And also in this file, which is the input.css file, which essentially gets compiled to the output.css file, is where you can also insert your own custom defined class utilities for Tailwind, and then you can use that in your HTML files or in your JavaScript files or JavaScript XML files, depending on what type of technology you're using, right? But one of the things that you should kind of be inquisitive about is remember the fact that for HTML, when we were talking about inserting CSS, right, we did discuss the fact that you can use the link tag within the head section, and that allows you to essentially, link an external CSS file. So in this particular case, we're doing output.css. We also have the option of using the style tag itself, right? Where within the head tags of your HTML page, if you do a style tag, then you can specify your CSS styling rules there. So that was basically the internal way of styling. But finally, there was also another method of kind of ingraining CSS to your HTML pages, which was basically the inline method of CSS, where you can use the style attribute. And then within the style attribute, you can specify all of your different CSS properties. For example, you can give it a height, border, width, color, whatever you want to do. Everything that is available on CSS, you can do it in an inline way, right? So at this point, what you should be inquisitive about is the fact that how is this method, that is class-based utilities for using Tailwind CSS, how is this any different or similar to inline CSS, right? Conceptually, you should have this understanding, and you should be able to answer this question if you are ever asked about this question in particular, is that how do these two differ? Like, is there any difference or are they the same and stuff like that? So what you have to keep in mind that yes, there are certain aspects of CSS styling that you can apply inline, right, by using the style attribute itself. But there are certain things you cannot do using the inline styling for CSS itself. So a few things to keep in mind is that you cannot add pseudo classes or pseudo elements within inline styling, right? So if you remember, there are a lot of times that we use the .hover effect, right, in order to do pseudo classes based stuff. There are also some other options of pseudo classes, such that if you want to kind of style the active tab differently, if you're designing your nav bar, then you would use something like a dot active, right? Similarly, if you think about your pseudo elements, right? If you want to select the first sentence or the last child of a particular table and stuff like that, then those were pseudo elements. So this is the first line of like first contention of difference between inline styling versus Tailwind CSS, is that even though they do seem a little bit similar, that is, we are applying the styling by using HTML attributes, right? You cannot achieve the full set of CSS styling through inline styling, but you can do so using Tailwind CSS, right? So always keep this in mind, because sometimes people might ask you this question. If you are applying for a front-end development or a full stack development interview question, it can come up that if you're using a front-end framework, how does that, like Tailwind CSS, how does that differ from essentially inline styling? Okay. The second point of difference is basically, and it kind of extends the first point of difference, is that there are certain aspects of responsive design, right? So if you remember, in CSS, if you're writing the basic CSS syntax, we had to use this syntax, which was basically @media query, which was like a function prototype. And within the function prototype, you had to pass in the parameter which you wanted to check, and then perform some stylings based on whether it was true or false based on that, right? So if you did something like this and you said max width is equal to 768 pixel or something like that, in order to define the width of the device that is, or the viewport that is trying to access that particular element or that particular website, right? Then this is how you would do this in basic CSS syntax, right? If you remember, when we were doing the same thing, that is responsive design, but we were using something like Tailwind CSS, then instead of writing that media query, there are predefined syntaxes within Tailwind that allows us to essentially implement our responsive design. So for example, if you want to define for small screens any kind of specific styling rules or any kind of particular behavior, when a small screen is accessing it, we use SF. And then with a colon, that is following the Tailwind CSS syntax, we specify whatever the Tailwind attribute that we want to, or Tailwind rule that we want to essentially implement, right? Similarly, there are some rules for medium screens, which is identified by MD, and then large screens will basically, if you do small and medium, whatever remains is basically the large screen itself, right? And in the input.css file, you can also define for yourself that what is the height and width in pixels for a small and medium screen. Remember, there is a lot of utilities that Tailwind CSS documentation gives us. It's plenty, especially for beginner to intermediate level. You wouldn't be needing much of your own, right? It doesn't mean that you cannot define it. It's just that you have a lot to work with, right? But when you get to the advanced level of specifically working with Tailwind CSS in particular, then you can rewrite the whole kind of directive by yourself and add a lot of stuff into it, right? If you get a lot proficient in working with CSS, right? Which is a long journey in itself, because you see, I wouldn't say the problem, but the challenge that we face as developers is that, at least I can speak for myself, is that our understanding of design is a little bit less compared to our understanding of implementation. If somebody tells us that, hey, this is what the design looks like, go ahead and implement it, then we can find the different, things that we need in order to implement that particular rule, right? But if we ourselves are responsible for both design and development, then we are kind of shaky, because we don't understand what good design looks like, right? We are not artists as such, okay? So when we say that you become proficient in CSS, that means you are undertaking the knowledge of good UI design as well. So the design is one half of it, and then the development is another half of it. So what we are focusing here is mostly on development. It's like, how do we develop something, right? But the design part is based on, okay, we are adopting it by looking at other styles that are available, other styles that people have recommended that is suitable for some project that you're working on, and then we make it our own, right? So that is where you go from. So at a certain point, when you become advanced in CSS, basically you have a good grasp on design as well, and not just development, right? So that is something that you have to keep in mind, right? So this responsive design part, which essentially Tailwind can support through inline styling, or we can say pseudo inline styling, so to speak, because we're not actually using the style attribute here, which is what kind of indicates inline styling. So if you did the inline styling with basic CSS by using the style HTML attribute, you cannot do responsive design here. There is no way for you to do @media query and stuff like that in the fullest extent that you can achieve through doing it through an external CSS or doing it through an internal CSS by using the style, right? So those are the two major differences. Just to highlight it again, is that the implementation of pseudo classes and pseudo element behaviors is not fully possible through the style attribute or basically inline styling, and you cannot achieve the full extent of custom behaviors of responsive design through inline styling as well. But these restrictions are not applicable when you are basically using a framework like Tailwind CSS. So the class utilities that are provided with Tailwind CSS framework can support both of those use case scenarios, right? So if you ever face this question, try to keep that in mind, that it is not the same, right? And these are the contentions, or these are the points which kind of differentiates it, right? So moving onwards, we can now start working with JavaScript. Okay. At this point, we have an understanding of how to structure our HTML pages, okay, or structure any kind of website that we want to work with. We have an understanding of how to design it. And when we are talking about designing it, remember the key factors that you have to remember. First and foremost, whenever you start with CSS, always keep in mind the box model, right? That is the first step that you should have in your head when you're developing with CSS, that, okay, what is the box model and how does the box model apply to the entirety of my page? Because the box model dictates the spacing and the positioning of your elements against each other on the entire page, right? So you have to keep in mind that you will have some content, but the content has a border, and the separation of the border from the content is basically the padding. And then around the entire element, you can have a margin, right? So that way, when you want to lay things out on your web page, right, then you remember that, okay, if I want to have some spacing between two elements on my web page, then I have to increase the margin, because the margin is basically the absolute boundary between the two elements, right? If I want to space out the contents from the border of the element itself, then I have to increase or decrease the padding itself and not the content, right? So these are the things that you have to keep in mind. This is some of the suggestions of the best practices that for somebody who is beginning to work with CSS, the starting point is the box model. And you always remember the different properties of the box model, right? So the two main properties of the box model that you will be more frequently using is basically the border, and then the padding, and then the margin, right? So remember these three things. The next, when you move forward with CSS, is your layout. And when you want to work with your layout, you have to work with two things. One is display. And we talked about display in HTML as well, that there will be block, inline block, and inline itself, right? And then there is a fourth attribute that CSS provides for display itself, that is none. So if you apply something as none, right, if you apply the CSS rule, that element will not be a part of the DOM unless you specify otherwise or do something else, right? So we saw how can we do this by the implementation of the hamburger menu, right? When we were designing responsive design, we made it none. And then when the screen size shortens, then we made the display to block, right? And it showed up because of that, right? So keep that in mind. And then there are position attributes, right? So there are position attributes. So to jog your memory, position was something with respect to absolute and relative. Remember, we made a parent relative and we made the child absolute to that relative parent, right? So when you want to kind of anchor something to a particular element, the relationship is applied based on the position CSS property, and the values are basically, you make the parent relative and you make the child absolute to the parent, right? Similarly, there are also certain position attributes. So I remember there was an example, or not example, but there was a question where you wanted to kind of make the footer or the header sticky, right? So there is actually a value where you can set the position to be sticky. So if you do sticky, then wherever that element is on the page, it will remain there. So generally, you use this position sticky on your nav bars, generally on your nav bar specifically, because if you have a very big page, and if you're scrolling down and you want that nav bar to not disappear, right, and you want it to stick to the top side of your window, right, then you set the position to sticky for those nav bars and stuff like that, right? So these are some of the examples of positioning layout. And after that, everything else is mostly like aesthetic based. And when I say aesthetic based, it means like you changing the text color, you changing the size of the font. If you want to put some underlining, if you want to put some background color, some background images, and those kind of things, right? So if you are able to kind of grasp your mind around all of these basic properties and have an understanding of what are some of the different values and some of the examples of the use cases that can be utilized in order to implement these values, then you have an understanding of the foundational CSS. Right? So that is what you have to keep in mind. All right. So moving forward, what we want to learn now is basically how do we implement interactivity on our websites, right? So essentially, when you put some interactivity, so right now, the design that we have achieved till this point is like, yes, there is very little basic interactivity, like, okay, the user hovers their cursor over a certain area, and that area becomes, different in terms of styling, right? But it is not really like programming, right? So you want to be able to have the user provide inputs, right? Give inputs, grasp that input, do some processing on that input, and then return some output based on the input that the user has provided, right? And this also forms the foundation of like a form where the user can submit the data, and you package that whole data, and eventually, if you do have a backend, you can send that data to the backend itself, right? So this is like the gateway to that kind of development process, right? So whenever you add this dynamic nature to your websites, right? Or this interactive nature to your websites, you no longer have a website. What you end up having is a web application, because there is some sort of application, some sort of logic behind what you're developing, right? There is an applied process that is going on internally, right? So the way to do it, and the gateway to this is not the St. Louis Arch. It is basically the JavaScript. Okay, it's a bad joke, but still, you get the idea. All right. So in order to work with JavaScript, right, it starts off simple and gets complicated only if you are not able to visualize. Okay. So to give you like a very high level picture of the entirety of vanilla JavaScript, that is what we will be working with, because we don't want to work with any kind of external libraries at this point of time before we understand what interactivity is and how you implement it. Once we do understand it, we will not use the, there are some JavaScript libraries that are out there, like jQuery is there and stuff like that, but we don't need that. The library we will use it is much more proficient than all those libraries, which is the React JS library. But before we get to that point, there are a few things that we need to work with, right? Or we need to have an understanding. So the pen is working, that's good. So the roadmap of how we are going to learn JavaScript here, and based on the survey that all of you gave at the beginning of the semester, a lot of you gave the response of medium on JavaScript, whereas HTML, CSS, and everything else was low. So I'm assuming that at least most of you have some level of understanding of what JavaScript is as a programming language. So we will move forward with that knowledge in mind. Okay. So I will move a little bit fast, but if you're losing me, again, please just, if you don't want to speak up in class, then you can send me an email separately and I will kind of, reorganize myself based on that. So, okay. So coming to JavaScript. All right. So the way we are going to learn it is basically cover JavaScript as a programming language. You will first talk about this. So we will talk about all of the basics that any traditional programming language, whenever you're learning a new programming language, there are different constructs that you need to learn, right? So what does those constructs look like? And there is certain differences if you compare it to languages, stricter languages such as Java, or even less stricter languages like Python, right? So there are some similarities, but there are some differences as well. So we want to look at, JavaScript as a programming language, talk about what are the aspects that are involved in variable declarations, talk about different constructs such as the if-else statements. You can also do switch case statements here as well. Okay. We will look into, working with functions, function prototyping in JavaScript itself, because this is going to be very crucial moving forward into React.js, because there everything is functional. All right. You also need to know how to work with arrays. Okay. So in order to store different types of elements that you have on the page, right? And then we will also look into object declaration, and of course, a little bit on classes. Although we won't be using classes that much, basically, we still need to have an understanding of objects. That is something that you'll be seeing quite often the more and more we move forward in this course, right? Also, once JavaScript is done, then we will move into what we call as DOM manipulation using JavaScript. All right. And when we go there, basically, this is the section what we refer to as vanilla JavaScript. The reason why we say vanilla JavaScript, or sometimes it is also called plain JavaScript, is because we're not using any kind of external JavaScript libraries, for example, like jQuery, in order to do these manipulations, right? We are specifically using JavaScript itself and nothing else. So that is why the name vanilla is coming from. In order to understand DOM manipulations, the first thing, and this is more of a revision than like a new thing, is for you to again go back, make sure that you understand the DOM structure. If you do not understand the DOM structure at this point, the tree-like structure that we talked about in HTML, this life is going to be very difficult when you're working with DOM manipulations, okay? Because essentially, at this point of time, you have to imagine all of the things that you did when you were in the data structure classes, where you had to search for a particular element, insert a particular element, update a particular element, and delete a particular element, right? So if you're working with any data structures, those are the 4 essential tasks that you have to perform, right? On any data structures that you're working with, whether that be arrays, linked lists, or queues, stacks, and stuff like that. You need to know how to perform traversal. You need to know how to perform insertion. You need to know how to do deletion. And you need to know how to do updates. Okay, so essentially the DOM is a tree-like structure at the end of the day. It's a data structure, right? So we will be using DOM manipulation and performing these activities to actually perform this manipulation itself, right? There are 2 APIs which will help us in performing these DOM manipulations that we will be calling frequently. Okay, so the first one is basically the window API. All right, so the window API is any kind of browser environment. So if you're looking at this browser environment, this entire Mozilla window, this is one API, right? So there are many different properties. When you think of an API, basically what you're doing is you're calling an object of the prototype that has already been implemented for you. So there are many different properties which are encapsulated within that particular object. So that means if you do something like window dot, so that will give you a lot of different options as to what are the different properties that are encapsulated within this particular object, right? So this is one of the objects that helps you in order to know that what kind of browser a client is using, what is the version, those kind of things, and you can perform certain manipulations based on that. But the more useful one, which directly relates to the manipulation aspect of it, is known as the document API. Okay, and the reason why the document API is the most important thing in this particular topic is because if you revise or kind of recall what the root node of the DOM element was, right, of the DOM structure was, at the very top, you have document. Okay, and then below document, you have HTML as the first structure, right? And then from HTML, you had the head, and then you had the body, and then everything else beneath that, right? So basically, whenever you want to refer to this web structure or this web page, which is this tree structure, you have to start with the document API itself. And from the document API, there are many different methods, many different properties that are encapsulated within the document object that you can access in order to perform your manipulations. Okay. Then there is a specific portion of interactivity, of implementing interactivity. That is, how do you implement those interactivity with the users, right? Let's say if the user writes their name on the field, how do you take that name and, let's say, display a message back to the user saying that, hello, John, welcome to this particular portal, or whatever you want, right? So how do you add that? How do you make that dynamic, right? So to do that, there is a specific aspect of vanilla JavaScript that is known as event listeners, right? Event on any kind of web application is said to be like a single mouse click, like a left click or a double left click, any kind of keyboard press, any kind of key press that you want to do, and there are many different types of event listeners, right? So we need to understand the basics of how you want to implement the event listeners, and you would want to know what are the different types of event listeners, right? So we will work on this, and that's about it that you have to understand for just vanilla JavaScript, right? And we will kind of extend this knowledge and move into React.js and try to implement the framework aspects of React, okay, which builds on top of JavaScript itself, okay? So this is what we want to cover. And so today we will start with the basics of JavaScript as a language, right? So for those who already know, this will be a recap. For those who are new to it, what I will suggest is remember how you do the implementations of the basic programming aspects in whatever language that you're familiar with. Everybody responded with their language that they're comfortable with. So refer to that, recall that how did you do all of those different things in the language that you're comfortable with already, right? It could be C, C++, Python, Java, whatever it is, right? And then once we discuss those same programming aspects in JavaScript language, understand the logic, identify the differences in syntax, but be familiar with what it is trying to achieve. Make sense, right? So keep that in mind, make a note of it, and that will make it easier to kind of pick up the language a little bit faster than thinking of it as a completely new thing, because it's not a new thing, it's just the syntax changes. Of course, there are certain functional differences, and we will talk about it in a little bit, right? So in order to work with any kind of JavaScript stuff, so I will just switch back to this demo1 HTML, and I will start putting in some JavaScript into that. So we are already there, I think. Okay, so this is the stuff that we want to use, and I will just reuse this. So anyways, so remember, when we're working with this plain JavaScript stuff or vanilla JavaScript stuff, the way I personally like to set up the directory structure is just put the JavaScript in its own folder. And then the initial JavaScript file that I'm going to work with, I'm just going to call it index.js, right? That's how I would want to work with it, okay? And then if you are integrating Tailwind demo, you can decide whether you want to send that JavaScript page to the client. If you want to do that, you can put it into the distribution folder or the build folder. If you do not want to propagate the JavaScript, then you can basically put it in the SRC file. Essentially, you would want to propagate JavaScript. If your JavaScript page is not with the client itself, then it won't be able to find the logic that you have applied and implemented on your web page itself, right? So essentially, this whole folder structure that you have, you can essentially put that inside your distribution folder and continue down that line, right? As long as you know that there is nothing in this folder that the user will have some issues in accepting on the client side, right? So basically, the if-else part or the decision-making part on what should you put in distribution versus what should you put in source is based on the fact that what do you necessarily need to be placed on the client's terminal. So basically, whenever I open a web page here, I get a portion of all the contents that is allowing me to work with this web page on this terminal itself, right? So you make that decision that when you're developing a web application, that what the client needs to have on their terminal versus what needs to be on your server that is basically serving that particular web application, right? And based on that decision making, you decide what should be present in the source versus what should be present in the distribution folder. And sometimes some people will also call this a build folder, because after the compilation, whatever the resulting files are, you basically put that here in this particular folder, right? So that is the only difference if you continue to work with Tailwind CSS. And I would urge you to continue to work with Tailwind CSS because eventually that is going to make your life easy, okay? Or if you are new to CSS, you can work with both of them, so that you get more and more confident with the basic CSS syntax as well as the Tailwind part. But anyways, so the first thing to keep in mind is how JavaScript is executed, right? Because when you work with any basic programming languages, the first thing is the environmental setup. Is like how do you set up the environment and those kind of things. Now, the funny thing is, prior to 2008, 2009, the only place where you could run JavaScript was the browser, right? So every browser has its own JavaScript engine, and that is the environment that is capable of handling JavaScript programs, okay? So for example, Internet Edge has its own JavaScript engine that is known as Chakra. Then Mozilla Firefox has its own JavaScript engine that is known as Monkey Spider. Don't ask me why they are named as such. And then there is Chrome, which has its own JavaScript engine that is known as the V8 JavaScript engine, not your car engine, but that's how they named it, right? So that is how JavaScript was only be able to execute it, right? So if you go to, let's say, our Chrome window, and we don't want to know what's new here, we always come up with something. And if you press F12, which is basically the shortcut for the developers menu, at the very top, you will see that there is this tab called console, right? So if you go to this tab, and if you do things like 1+1, it is able to perform these operations. And if you are familiar with Python to a certain degree, you will see that there is some similarities of this with the Python shell when you open it on the terminal. And then for those who are aware with Python, for those who are not, it's okay. But what I'm trying to say here is that this is an interpreter. Remember, there are two types of way in which you can run your programs, right? So you have the option of a compiled language, like JavaScript is, Java is, right? And then there is interpreted language, where the interpreter will go line by line and will stop at any line if there is a bug, right? It won't proceed any further, similar to what Python is, right? So JavaScript falls in the category of interpreted language. There is no compilation aspect that is involved here. Things will go line by line, and if there is something wrong with one line, it will throw you that error at that point of time. So it will not compile the entire program and tell you that, hey, these are the set of errors, these are the set of warnings, fix it, right? It won't be able to do that. So that is the first thing that you have to remember, that the environment, at least prior to 2008, the only place where you can run JavaScript was through your browser environment, right? So right now we are in Chrome's V8 environment. So I think, cross this, right? So you have to press the developers option. The shortcut for that is F12 across any browser. And then you have to go to the console tab, and then you can write all your JavaScript code, right? So after 2008, there was a developer or scientist with Google. I forgot his name, but the idea that he came up with is that if he takes this V8 engine, which is the JavaScript interpreter for Chrome, and then he decided to wrap this around the runtime environment of C++, right? So essentially what happened is that instead of having a browser support, since he took the browser engine itself, wrapped it around the runtime library, which was written in C++, you can, through that C++ directives, call on all of the different functionalities that the JavaScript engine was supporting, but through the browser environment. So he created kind of like this bridge such that we can execute JavaScript outside the browser. And as a result of that, JavaScript truly became a programming language in its own because of this change. Because before that, without a browser, you cannot run JavaScript. So imagine like you write an entire full-fledged program, and now you have to open Chrome, run it, and then check in the console what the output is. That is kind of very tedious in nature, right? But since the development of that runtime library, which came to be known as Node.js, right, we can essentially execute our JavaScript programs outside of the browser environment at that point of time, right? So there are two options for you in order to kind of debug, test out your JavaScript programs. Is you can either choose to be in the console section of your developers option, that is one area, or if you have Node.js installed, which I believe everybody has Node.js installed at this point of time, then you can essentially use the node command and then just write the name of the file in order to get the output of your JavaScript program, the basic JavaScript program. If you're developing something of JavaScript on the website, right, of course, you will be able to see the output on the web page itself, right? But if you're working on some plain program, or basically where this is more useful is if you write your server logic using JavaScript. Because remember, if you are only able to execute JavaScript on the browser itself, you can never write a backend using that, because backend is its standalone logic, right? So that is why Node.js is considered to be the backend that is written using JavaScript, because the node environment, the runtime environment, essentially allows for the execution of JavaScript outside of the browser environment. And that's what it makes capable of supporting backend logic as well, right? So just to digress a little bit, keep in mind that for those who are learning this for the first time and you're not familiar with, let's say, full stack development, that is to also add backend to it, after this class, a logical extension for you to learn backend development is with Node.js, because then you don't have to learn another new technology. All you need is JavaScript again, right? So the amount of new things that you have to absorb will be less. you might come across resources that will say that PHP is much stable and there is a wide usage of PHP. That is very true. There is no denying that, right? But for beginner users, just to get a feel of how that full stack environment works, in order to minimize your footprint of new things that you have to learn, right? You're already learning a lot in this class itself, right? 5 or 6. Okay. So just extend that to Node.js backends so that all you stick with is JavaScript and nothing else. So you don't have to learn another new set of technology. All right. So that is with respect to the environment where you can run JavaScript. That is with respect to what JavaScript is, interpreted language and not a compiled language. So the next thing is how do you output something in JavaScript? Because remember, there is no reliable debugger for JavaScript. So you have to use your print statements to kind of identify where your code is hanging. Right? It's kind of a little bit tedious, but you have to become better and better at that point, right? So you will have to check every portion of your code where you wanted to add a debug point, right? The debugging point, you basically have to replace that debugging point with an output statement. So your output statement is going to be one of your best friends when it comes to debugging here in JavaScript. So the best way to do it here in JavaScript, and I think we don't have the JavaScript extension installed here. So if you go to the marketplace, search for JavaScript. Okay. And then if you look at this JavaScript ES6, that is the current version of JavaScript, the ECMAScript 6 family that we are using right now. Just install that. So it will give you some JavaScript support. And while we are working with JavaScript, just also install this library here. So when you say React, when you look for React itself, it will give you this ES7 plus React Redux, React Native snippets. So this is the entirety of the snippets that we will need after we land into React, move into Redux. Redux is something for state management specifically. Don't have to worry too much about it right now. And then React Native is for the mobile app development that we need. So might as well just install these 2 scripts. So you have some of the coding support that you will need as a beginner to work with this and remind yourself of how to write the different code, right? And life will be a little bit easier compared to that. All right. So if we do this, so if we just type CLG, right, which is basically a short form of console.log, that is essentially your print statement. All right. And the print statement inside, if you're just, let's say, trying to print an entire object, then you can just give the name of the object. But essentially, if you're trying to print a string data, right, all you need to do is just do this, right? So something like this, and you can say, this is a print statement from JavaScript, something like this. And you save it, and Prettier will give the semicolon here. Okay, so now what you can do is at this point of time, let me see where I am with respect to the directory. We are in the root directory, right? So we will go into the JS, okay, and we will simply say node and then index.js. So if you do that, the node command, that's the runtime environment. Remember, Node.js, not a framework. Node.js, somebody asks you what is a Node.js? Node.js is a runtime environment, which is basically written using C++, and that is wrapped around Google Chrome's JavaScript engine, which is V8. You have to be specific because it does not wrap around other JavaScript engines. It specifically wraps around Google's JavaScript engine, which is V8. Okay, so keep this description in your mind. First of all, somebody asks you what is Node.js. Again, it's a runtime environment. It is not a framework. Sometimes people confuse it as a framework because they see that Node.js is used for server-side development, so they think, oh, it's also a framework, maybe. Similar to that, React.js is a library of JavaScript. It is not a framework. You can call it a front-end framework, but it's a library, right? And the way this library has been created is by wrapping C++ code around Google's JavaScript engine, that is V8. Please keep that in mind, not Zilla's JavaScript engine or not Microsoft's JavaScript engine. Okay, so this is one of the ways when you can execute any code. You essentially use the node command, right, which is calling the runtime environment, and then you specify the name of the file which you want to execute. So remember, in order to execute this, I traversed or changed my directory to the JavaScript subdirectory where index.js is. right? If you were outside this directory, for example, if you were back in the root directory, then you would have to write the full path of where your file is. So that means you would have to do something like js/index.js. And then if you execute it, you will get the same output, right? So sometimes from experience, people have forgotten that I made a change in the directory here and then just wrote node index.js. So they did the command from the root directory here, but there is no file called index.js in the root directory, right? If I do this, you can see here there is no index.js. So please make sure that whenever you're calling the node command and you give the full path wherever it is, okay? So that is one of the difference. The other way that you can view this file itself is that if you go to your index.html file here, and let's say if I open this with live server, we don't want to open this because this will open, I think, Internet Edge, but that's fine. All right, so if I go to my developers tool here, I don't want to do welcome. Okay, so essentially, once you load the index.js file here at this point of time, then you should also be able to see the no, don't show this again. You should be able to see the output here as well. Okay, in this location. So basically, you have to load the index.js file here. All right, so these are the two ways in which you can, don't show again, get the output of your JavaScript pages, right? So there are too many browsers that are open. I don't want to load this. All right. Okay, so print statement done, environment done. There are two options. So if you're just doing plain and simple testing and debugging and learning how things work, then you can either use the plain console environment, or eventually we will work with this. So, oh, I forgot to link this, sorry. So what you want to do next is you want to kind of attach your JavaScript files to your HTML files, so that when your HTML loads, it also kind of loads the JavaScripts that comes along with it, right? So the third step is just like we worked with CSS files, and that CSS needs to be linked with your HTML file. Similarly, when you're writing any kind of JavaScript files, you would also want to link that to your HTML file, because essentially the landing page will load first, which is index.html in this particular cases that we are working with. And then that will load all the resources that is associated with it. So it could be the CSS file and it could be the script files. Okay. So the next thing that you want to do is basically go to your index.html file. Okay. Whatever file that you're working with. So again, there are two different options that is available. You can either load your JavaScript files using what is known as the script tags. So that means within your index.html pages, right? Just like we had style tags, you have the option of what is known as script tags. Okay, so within these script tags, you can write your JavaScript codes, your basic JavaScript codes that works with DOM manipulation. Okay, so this is one of the options. We rarely do this. Okay, just like we said that we don't do style tags in HTML, we don't do script tags in JavaScript unless it is a very short script that you need, right? Like very, very short script. If you have a full-fledged JavaScript code, you would always, like 9 out of 10 times, want to write it in a separate JavaScript file and then link it to your HTML file. So instead of doing this way of using script tags, what we are going to do is basically link this JavaScript page or this JavaScript file that we have within the JavaScript folder, right? So in order to do that, we will use this abbreviation, that is the script file with a source. Okay, there is no link href here. There is a source that we have to use. So the href is in as you can see here, with respect to adding images or with respect to adding style sheets, we always use the hyperreference attribute, right? But for the script linking, we are going to use the source attribute. Okay, so in the source attribute, we essentially specify the location. So right now, this index.html file is in the root folder. So we have to give the // to indicate it is in the root folder. And then we go to the JavaScript subfolder, and then there is index.js here. Okay, so this is how you want to kind of link your JavaScript files to this particular page. Now, there is always a discussion with respect to your script tags, okay, or when you're linking your JavaScript file, is when should the JavaScript resources be loaded as your website is being loaded, right? So what I mean by that is that eventually, if you notice here, HTML is just sequential, right? So everything that you have the metadata gets loaded first. So that means all the resources that needs to be linked with your web pages will get linked, right? And then it will go to the body tag, and then sequentially, whatever it sees, it will start rendering that on the web page. That is basically how the browser works. Now, notice here that JavaScript in itself, a lot of the programming logic will be implemented when the user interacts with the resources that is on your page, right? Everybody follows this logic, right? So there is always this discussion is when should you load your JavaScript resources? Because your JavaScript resources is going to be heavy, right? You see all these news pages, newspaper pages that you go to, it just pops open a bunch of ads and everything that is going on, gives you these offers. Those are all JavaScript, right? So what I'm trying to tell you is that when you have JavaScript resources for your web pages, it is going to slow down the rendering of your web page itself. So you always have to kind of ask yourself as a developer is, do you want to load your JavaScript resources before the web page gets rendered, or first render out the web page and then you kind of load your JavaScript resources? So essentially, the option that I'm telling you about is that you just need to take out this JavaScript script tag here and then put it at the very end of the body, right? So that is the option that you can do, because if all of the loading is sequential, then, and you want to load your JavaScript after you have rendered your web page itself, then you put it after your body, the last portion of your body has finished rendering, and then you put your script tags here. So that means the browser will render the entirety of the web page and then see that there is a script tag here. And so that will basically upload, or not upload, but basically that will associate the JavaScript resources to the page. So that means your client, your users can see the page first without there being a big downtime where sometimes you visit a website, nothing shows up for a second or two. If you have ever experienced this kind of scenario, that is because the JavaScript is loading at that point of time. However, the problem is with respect to best practices, you don't want to put your script with your HTML. Because remember at the very beginning, we were talking about the fact that you don't want to mix up anything with HTML, whether that is CSS, whether that is JavaScript and stuff like that. So as far as best practices is concerned, you need to put your JavaScript linking within the head portion only, so that you don't kind of mix things up here. So the question that is for you then is, how do you, by following this best practice, still be able to implement what you desire to implement, that is, allow the browser to render the body of your HTML first and then load your JavaScript page? So does everybody understand this question, right? So this is basically enabled with the help of an attribute, right? So I will give you a little adventure here. Can you find the attribute that helps us do this? Does everybody understand the question? Right? In person, well, I can see, but online, if you can understand it. So while we talk about other stuff going forward, why don't you just do a little exercise and see what script tag attribute helps to delay the loading of JavaScript resources on your web page. Just go ahead, check it, see if you can find something. Do a quick search right now. Check it out. So what you're looking for is basically the script tag attribute that helps to delay the loading of JavaScript resources on the web page. Check it out, let me know. It's 11:02 right now. Take 2 minutes, 11:04, do some search, find it, see if you can. And I'm not monitoring the chat, so if anybody finds it online, just, raise your hand or something so that it gives us a notification here.
I'm seeing something called defer.
Yeah, it's the one I was finding. It looks like it's a toss-up between defer and the onload method.
Anyone? Find anything? Defer? Yes, that's correct. Okay. So essentially, the script or the attribute, it's a Boolean attribute that you have to use is basically defer. So this enables us to follow through the JavaScript best practices. Yes, sir. Async is something that you're waiting for a promise there. So when you call it using async itself, right? So that means you have made a call and you're expecting a promise from it, right? So it will send you back the data. You have not forgotten about it. What this is doing is this is just changing the sequence in which it is being rendered on the page. It is not an asynchronous call. It is still happening, but in a different order, right? So I'm just switching the order. So that means instead of, if this was an async call, so this would have been completely thrown out of the programming execution tree until it comes back to you. Do you understand? So let's say an async is used mostly in a database call, like a database call, let's say for MongoDB and stuff like that, right? So what happens is you make a database call to get the data of, let's say, the list of users that's working for a company, and then you forget about it, right? And then you continue with your execution. So what happens is that when you execute an async, the programming logic will have a promise to it, right? So that means it is promising that it will give back some call. If the promise fails, there will be an error, right? If the promise is successful, you will have result, right? So due to that async aspect, whatever logic you are kind of combining or wrapping with async is completely kicked out of that execution tree, right? And happens asynchronously in its own execution tree. This is not kicking it out of the whole execution tree, is just replacing the order in which it needs to be executed. So there is still a serial execution fashion, it's just not the way it is intended to. So if we didn't have this defer attribute, then when the page loads, everything in the metadata loads, right? This link attributes loads, this CSS style sheet loads, and then the JavaScript resources load, and then your web page gets rendered, right? But we don't want this because sometimes your JavaScript is very heavy in nature, and that slows down the process because the browser needs to load the entirety of your JavaScript first, right? So what happens is then during those situations, the user just stares at a blank screen until your page starts to show up, right? So in order to avoid that, generally some sites, what you will see, if you see at use case scenarios and examples on the web, right? You will see that this script tag that is there comes right after the entirety of your HTML page. But what the problem is, HTML5 best practices tells you to not have anything that is CSS or JavaScript within the body of your page. That should be pure HTML, right? To minimize the mix-up, right? So if the best practices prevents us from writing the JavaScript here, then essentially we would have to write it in the head tag where it belongs. But that will cause it to load first again, and we go back to that problem. So we need an attribute that allows us to kind of move that order of execution after the HTML page. So what this defer attribute is telling is that, okay, you see, when the browser sees this and it encounters this defer attribute, it understands that, okay, I will just wait for it. I will execute everything that is in the body, and then I will load this. Okay, so it's just switching the order. It's not putting an async call on it. Okay. All right. So with that taken care of, so now I believe if we open it with this, go back to F12. All right. So we can see here that anything that is there in your JavaScript file can be viewed in the console section of your developers tool, right? So these are the two options that you have with respect to kind of testing out your JavaScript code, your debugging and stuff like that. So you can either work with Node.js or you can work with the console of your browsers, okay, whatever browser that you're working with. By the way, this right now is we are opening it as an Edge, right? So the engine is actually a little bit different. So if you open this page on Chrome, you will be using a different JavaScript engine and stuff like that, right? But right now, given the current day and age's support, there is not going to be much of a difference in that. Most of them will be able to support all of it, right? So let's talk about now moving on to data types and variables itself. All right, so that is the first thing that we need to do. Now that we understand the environment and stuff like that, we need to talk about storing values. Okay, that's the first thing that you need to learn for any programming language. So the funny thing is, if you think about Python, right? Let's start with Python. Python is a very relaxed language, and the whole notion of Python is that you create any variable name. So let's say you can do something like this, okay? And then you can just store the value. So if I do username 21, Python understands that the number, there will be an integer inside this variable, and we'll treat the data type of that variable as integer. If you put a string, it becomes a string and stuff like that, right? So that's a more relaxed language because you don't have stricter rules and regulations. Now, if you compare this or the variable declaration from languages like C, C++, JavaScript, and even TypeScript, by the way, which is a part of the very stricter languages, you have to first declare the type of your variable and then provide the same value which belongs to that data type itself. So that means if I want to declare an integer value, then I will have to do integer and then 21. So that means the value here needs to be the same as the type that you declare here. Okay, now with this understanding, let's see how variable declaration works in JavaScript itself. Now, there is a type, but it's not a data type, right? So the type of the variables that you declare in JavaScript is basically the scope of where you can use that variable values. So it is basically similar to Python, that is, whatever value you give, that becomes the data type within that variable container. But there is also a type, which is basically the scope of the variable in JavaScript. So it's not the same. It's like taking a mixture of these different techniques from these stricter languages and these relaxed languages. Python came after JavaScript, but it was there actually quite a while. Yeah, it was there. Yeah. So there are three different scopes, and let me help you understand what this scope means. Okay, so the first thing is comment in JavaScript. So writing a comment in JavaScript is basically 2 forward slashes. This is a comment. All right. You can also do the thingy where you have this forward slash star forward slash. If you want to like, this is a multi-line comment. Okay, so those are the ways in which you can essentially write comments in 2 ways, right? So now let's talk about variables. All right. So if you do variables in JavaScript, all right. So there are 3 different options that are available to you in terms of type. Okay, variables in, so there will be a lot of typos, please just excuse that. Variables in JS have scope. What does that statement mean? So there are 3 different types, 3 types of scope present. Okay, so the first one is basically known as var. Var has global scope. Second one is called let. That is basically the syntax, by the way. Var is the syntax, let is the syntax, has local scope. Okay, and then the third one and the last one is basically const. That is, you cannot redeclare the values. You can assign it always, but you cannot redeclare it or reassign it, right? So that is basically the difference. So let's take an example and see if we do something like this, that var age equals to 21. Okay, and then you can also do let username. And by the way, another thing, JavaScript uses camel casing. So that means the first letter has to be small and the second part of the phrase has to be capitalized. It has to be, that is basically the documentation standard that needs to be followed for JavaScript. Okay, unless you're working with a class name or an object name, the first letter will always be small. The only exception is when you're working with objects, when you're working with classes, then the name changes, all right? But other than that, please make sure that throughout you're using camel casing, all right? So let's say I do let username be John Doe, okay, something like this, not just John, all right? And then const phi, because we are, why not, 3.14, something like this. So what is the differences between these three types of declarations? All right, so here we are saying that this is basically global. Can somebody explain what that does mean? In a program, what does global mean? Yeah.
Accessed by any function in the program.
Correct, exactly. So when we speak of scoping, right, when we talk about scoping in a particular program, we essentially are talking about which portions of the program can access the values of the variables that you are working with, right? A very simple example of this that you should be familiar with is when you were working with even Java or even C++ or even Python. So imagine running a program like this. So I'll just write the code here because we don't have a setup for Python and other stuff. Let's say you have a for loop, right? So if I do something like this, int count equals to 0, right? You can just choose the language, but I'm using a pseudo code here. And then I do something like this, right after this, that for count equals to 0, count less than 10, count plus plus. It's a basic for loop. And then I have the curly braces. And then I can just do output, something like output count is, and then whatever the value of count is, right? And then if I output count here again, what will be the output? So initially count is 0. It's just redoing that, right? I'm not changing anything here. This will run how many times? If the value starts from 0, and if the condition is less than 10, how many times will this code execute? The for loop? 10, right? It's not a trap question. Okay. No, it's 0 itself is counted as 1, right? So 0 to 9 is 10 itself, right? So you will see this output 10 times. So you will see a printout statement from going from 0 to 9, right? But what will be the output here? Careful. This is, yes. So the final value that will be here is 10, because this breaks out of the loop when the value becomes 10, because 10 is not 10 less than 10, right? So when it goes out of the for loop, it gets 10. But the reason why you get this output is because this count variable is declared outside of the for loop. Make sense? So now if I change this code again, and if I do something like this, if I let go of this statement here, can I have a different color? So let's say now in the second case, I remove this and I declare this here, int count equals to 0. What will be the output? You will still get the same stuff here, but in this situation, you will get an error. And this is where scope plays into the picture, because when you declare something within a particular statement or a control structure, right, then you can only use that value within that control structure. So that means if you declare any variables outside of any control structure, then the scope of that variable becomes the entire program itself. And this is what we call as scope being global in nature, right? And in this particular case, where if you declare a variable within a control structure, then you call the scope local to the control structure. So that means if you declare int count equals to 0 for this for loop, then the scope of count is local to this for loop. So that means outside of these curly braces, which is the body of the for loop, the existence of this variable is basically void. It does not exist. And that is the reason why you get this error. So that is what scope means. Yes.
If we had the int count equals 0 outside and int count equals 0 inside, then would the output at the end be 0? We declared just the int count equals 0.
So walk me through it again. Where you,
So you know how you crossed out that first int count equals 0?
yeah, where do you want to put this?
We had right back where it was, so still global.
Yeah. So then this will be, so you want to declare this and this as well?
Yeah,
No, it will override it.
it'll right.
We are basically redeclaring something that is also redeclared, right?
Okay.
So if I do something like this is small completely, but if I, let's say, capitalize this, then depending on the language, it will be treated as two different locations in the memory.
Okay.
Then you can have one, this will be 0 and this will be 9. Okay, this still 9 and then it stops at that point of time, right? So it depends on the language. If a language is not, most of the languages are case sensitive that we work with, programming languages. So if you have the same name, it will be treated as the same location. So it will just override that location for both of them being 0. So I can start off this as 1 and then I can do it 0. Probably will get a warning as well that you are redeclaring the same thing. So that is something that is going to be there. It's not going to stop you, but that's what you will get, right? Okay. So this is basically what the scope means. All right. So in order to represent this scope, that is the local scope and the global scope, and please practice this in your memory again and again, because JavaScript, you will be using a lot of this. So here, when we say var age 21, and we say that the scope of age variable is global, so that means any control structure within this JavaScript file will be able to access and modify the value of var age. Okay. And I will tell you right now, don't use this ever. I know you will see a lot of tutorials out there which uses var, unless there is a very good reason for you to justify why you are using or declaring a variable as global. Don't do it. Not even just for fun. Okay. The standard, the programming standard right now is basically to use let. So this is local scope. Now, the funny thing is, if you declare this outside of any structure, then it will be local to the entire program itself. So that's why we are saying you don't have to use var. If you want to use something that is accessible across, then you can still use the let scope. Okay. So typically, even though I'm telling you that there are 3 different ways in which you can declare your variables, there are only 2 ways that you will be using majority of the times. So the first one is basically let variable name and then whatever data type that you want to plug it in. This will be local scope to scope to wherever you declare. Okay, so it could be the entire program, local to the program, which is kind of like, counterintuitive, but it helps when you're working with things like if-else statements, arrays, functions, objects. Then it can be only accessed by any entity that is associated within that control structure. Okay, and then this is kind of straightforward. If you declare something as const, okay, you cannot reassign the value. Okay, so this is something that remains constant across all of the different usage or all of the usage of this, right? So now, question is, what are the different data types that can be accommodated, or some of the more frequently used data types that is basically used, or we can see in JavaScript, all right? So the next thing that we want to talk about is data type. Now, data type, the variable will basically just inherit the value that you assign to it, all right? So here, the data type is basically number, okay? Here, the data type is string, all right? This is also numeric as well, okay? We don't have a specific distinction here between something called integer and float as such. You can call this as a floating point, but here we will always call this as a number. We don't call it as an integer as such, right? So some of the data types that you will work with is basically number, okay? So number is basically like whole numbers. Okay, like 21 and stuff like that. In addition to that, you will be working with strings. Sometimes you will see that there is a single apostrophe that is used. So something like single apostrophe John, or most of the time you will see this double quotes similar to what you are used to seeing as strings. You will see John like this, right? You will also see float values. Okay, so numbers such as 3.14 or whatever, that will be treated as floating point value. Please remember here, this could be a floating value, okay, but data type is still number. So that's what I meant, that there is no distinction between decimal and whole numbers in JavaScript itself. They are treated as numbers only, right? You can, as developers, talk about floats and integers and whole numbers and all those things, but JavaScript does not distinguish between them, okay? And then after that, you will have Boolean. That's not the spelling at all. Okay, so Boolean is, of course, always going to be either true or false, right? So if you want to set up Boolean values, that is what you are going to be doing. There is also a data type that is specific to JavaScript, which is a null data type. By the way, null is the absence of value. And the data type that you use, or the value that you assign, if you want to assign something as null, is basically the keyword null. Okay, similar to Boolean data types, as the keyword is true and false. For null data types, the data type or the value that you assign to it is null itself. There are also sometimes, if you want to define undefined data types, the keyword for that is again undefined itself, right? So these are all keyword based, and that is it. All right, and if you, so this is basically not a warning, but basically a case where if you declare and don't assign any value, then default data type is undefined. So please keep this in mind, because this is an important piece of information. So what I mean by this last statement is that if I let something like this, var, not var, never use var, let user age, and just leave this like this, right? So this is basically a declaration with the absence of assignment. Okay, so if you do this, then this is an undefined data type. So as a habit in JavaScript itself, if you want to avoid having this situation, always assign the value that you want to assign, even if it is an empty value, right? So that means if this needs to be assigned to a string, but let's say you don't know the exact value of the string that will be assigned to this variable, then you would still leave this as an empty string. Okay, so that the data type that will be present or inherited within this variable location is going to still be string and not undefined. So if you do not assign a value, it will be treated as undefined by default. That is something that you have to keep in mind of, right? In addition to that, let's say if you want to know the data type of a particular variable that is present, right? So here, if to figure out the data type of a variable, so what you need to do is basically you need to call the type of property and then associate that to the variable name. So that means if I do a console log, right, and then I say type of, okay, whoa, where did it go? Type of, so that is basically the method, and then followed by the name of the variable that I write. So let's say if I just simply write username, why does it keep going there? Okay, username. So if I do something like this, all right, at this point I need to execute this program in order to see the output there. So all I'm going to do is cd into the JS folder and then node and then index.js. Okay, so here you can see that the type of the username variable is basically string. So if you're uncertain about the type of any variable that you're working with, if you inherit somebody else's code and stuff like that, then all you need to do is you use this method, this property of type of, and then it will essentially be given to you. All right. There are also ways in which you can concatenate strings. All right. So working with strings, one of the important things that you do is concatenation of strings. All right. So for strings in other programming language, you might be familiar with the plus operator, which is the concatenation operator when it comes to utilizing it with string values itself. Otherwise, this is basically the arithmetic operator, okay, operator itself for addition. But if you use it in the context of string, then essentially this is going to act as a concatenating operator. And this is the old ways, right? As Darkseid says, you know, that we will use the old ways. So this is basically the old ways, right? So if you want to have an example of the old ways itself, right? So that means if you do the console log, and again, the snippet, if you have the extensions ready, is basically CLG and then hit enter, and then it will print everything and just hit the backspace, right? So we know that the string data type is something that we write within the double quotes. You can also do single quotes, but if you have prettier installed here, like I do, it will change it to double quotes eventually, right? So we can say the student name is, and then now you want to concatenate. So I will do a plus here, okay? And then I will use the variable name that has the student's name. So that is basically the username here. And then we can put this something like this, right? So if we now run this again, so if we control L this, and then run this program again. So you can see here, we can give a space here, save it, run this again. I think I might have clicked a few things that are not wrong. So now you can see here that this is the string value that we added. And then we are adding the value from the variable itself to the string, right? So this is basically how string concatenation works, but in the old ways. But right now, so we can say using the concatenation operator, okay, which is basically this guy. All right. But in more newer ways, that is after ES6, which basically establishes the standards of JavaScript as a programming language, we use what is known as template literals. Okay, and this is a more flexible way of writing your string concatenation, right? Makes your life a little bit easier. So the way we want to do it is not using single quotes or double quotes, but we use backticks. All right. This is what basically backticks look like. So if you're not familiar with backticks, if you look at your keyboard, right to the left of your one number key, right, you will see that there is a tilde symbol. The other part of that tilde symbol is basically backtick. So if you do not use shift and tilde, the symbol that you will get is basically backticks, right? So people get confused on this part a little bit. So QWERTY keyboard backticks. Okay, so hopefully something will show up here. Right. Okay, so open view image. Where is view image? There's no view image. Okay, so here, if you notice that this is the key that is backtick, not single quotes, not double quotes, but backticks. That is what starts the template literals in JavaScript. Okay, and the reason why we want to use backticks is because the same statement here that we wrote can be rewritten in the following format. The student name is, and then simply within this backticks, you can write the $sign, which is to basically acquire the value within a particular variable, give the curly braces after the $sign. So it is basically grabbing that variable, and then you just give the student name. So if you do this, the student name is using, let's say, template literals, so that we know that this is something different. Literals, okay, is this. So now if we run this program again in Node.js, then you can see the same thing, but now you don't have to use any operators. You can write it as a single string using this backtick. Anytime that you want to insert a new value, all you have to do is use this $symbol followed by the curly braces, and within the curly braces, you write your stuff. So now if I want to continue this statement, so let's say if I remove all of this, the student name is this, and their age is, so now if you want to write the age, So we have this age here, although this is in var. So I'll just convert this to, let's keep it at var so that people know this, right? And the student age is, so how do we do it? Put a dollar sign, put the curly braces, and then within the curly braces, just write the name of the variable, which is age here. So we will copy this and we will put it here, right? So if we save this, go back to our console. So now we can see that it just continues with it. This is a very useful tool for preparing your print statements. Okay, you don't have to, because you can just imagine that if you use the concatenation operator, you will have to keep on separating it again and again and again, and it will become like this clunky statement for very big printout statements, right? Here you can just continue to write it as a single statement without breaking it out, right? So life is much more easier when it comes to working with this. So other than that, for strings, all of the different operations that you are familiar with is also applicable here. So for example, let's say if I declare a string, I think we are almost out of time, but I'll show you a little bit. So string ops, okay. So let's say if we declare a string and say const student name is equals to, and then I can give Harry Potter, right? Something like this. So now let's say if you want to know the length of this string, that is how many characters are present. That is something, the very basic thing that we do. Essentially, this is important in order to run any kind of loops on top of this, or if you're trying to extract individual characters of a string and then do some processing on it, you basically need to know the length of the string. So what we want to do here is basically take the string name, which is basically our student name. Oh God, parent is accepted. All right, and then we just want to use the dot operator to access all the methods of the strings that is associated with this, and then you can essentially say length itself, right? So if you do that, then you can get the length of the string. So it will show you what is there. Okay, so here we can see that there is 12 characters. Now, please do count it because you need to know essentially what it is counting. So here, how much do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then the white space 12. So there is something interesting that you have to keep in mind, that it does not count the null character. Remember in C++, we had a null character at the very end, which always gets counted. So the entire length of the string becomes everything that you see plus a null character. JavaScript doesn't have that situation, right? So that is something that you need to be aware as a programmer. Similarly, if I just want to print a portion of this string, then I will use the method called substring, right? So here I will just do a CLG. I will call the string name itself, and then I will call on the method called substring. And the substring is basically a method, so it will take input parameters, and the parameters are first index, comma, last index that you want to print. So if I do something like this, 0 to 5, so it will only print whatever is on the 0th index of the string and whatever is on the 5th index of the string, right? So if I run this program now, hopefully I've saved it. So if I run node index.js, then you can see that I only get a portion of the substring, right? So similarly, if you want to print everything in uppercase or in lowercase, then you can do the student name dot, and then you can use the method. So you can see here you have 2 lowercase, 2 uppercase. So if you do 2 uppercase, that will basically convert the entirety. Oh, to uppercase is a function. So it will convert everything that you have to this particular method, right? So let me clear this console up. All right, so please remember this is a method. If you forget the brackets of a function call, then it will give you a weird error, not even an error. But this way you can also convert it to an uppercase, or you can convert it to a lowercase, right? And then let's say sometimes you see in regular expression that you want to save the individual characters of a string separated by a particular expression, right? Sometimes it could be a white space, sometimes it could be a comma. So, you know, in comma separated values, when you're reading a file, right, you have these expressions based on which you want to read that from the file. and then save it based on those separators, right? So if you want to do that, what you can do is essentially, again, you can use the string name itself, call on the method, and then the method that you need to use is basically split, right? And split is again a method call, so you need to give the opening and closing first brackets. And within this, the parameter that you specify is basically based on which expression do you want to split up the string. So here, if I give, let's say, a white space, right? So then it should give me two values. That is the first one and then the second one, right? So here it has created an array that has two indexes. The first index is the first word of my string, and the second index is the second word of my string. And the way this array was created was using this white space symbol. So if you do the same thing here again, right? But instead of, let's say, doing a white space, you say character by character, something like this, right? So if you do this, then hopefully we should see an array that stores every character in its own index. So this is a very powerful tool with respect to data analysis. If you're working with something of a simple fundamental data analysis where the user gives you some input and then you have to store it individually and do some operations on this, right? So your imagination can run wild at this point of time. So this is how you can essentially store it into the array by using this method called split, and the parameter itself being the expression based on which you're going to create the different indexes of your array, right? So those are the string operations. All right. So this is basically some of the very basic stuff that you can do in JavaScript. So to wrap up today's classes, in the next class, we will do the conditional statements, the if-else operations. So again, remember the key takeaways of today's lecture, okay, or today's learning that we did is understood how we can link our index.js files using the script tags to the index.html file. We learned about the environments where a JavaScript program can be executed and tested. Okay, so that is first of all, not this, but basically the developers section in the console tab. You can run all your different JavaScript code, and you can see here I'm also getting all of the different warnings and alerts for every page that is in JavaScript, right? The second option is if you have Node.js installed in your environment, then you can essentially run all your program using the node command followed by the file name itself, and it will work the same way, right? We learned about how you can declare variables in JavaScript, right? And the differences being how there are three different scopes of variable declaration: var, let, and cons. You will always use let and cons. So although you remember var, never use it. Okay, unless you have a very good explanation of why you are setting up a global scope environment. Okay, we talked about the different data types that JavaScript support, and you don't have to declare the data type as in stricter languages like Java, C++, or TypeScript. Whatever value you assign, that value, the data type becomes for that variable. Okay, we also talked about how to print different stuff, and we discussed about some of the different basic operations on strings that you can do, starting from string concatenation to getting a portion of the substring as an output, converting it to uppercase or lowercase, or splitting the string and storing it to an array by using a particular expression. Okay. In the next class, when we meet, we will discuss two more control statements, which basically makes a language a programming language, that is to make decisions using if-else statements, and then to repeat or automate a task by using loops, right? So those are the two major things. And if time permits, then we will move on to functions. All right. Okay, so I'll see you all online again next Tuesday. Wait, next Tuesday? Yeah, the winter break is the week after that. Yeah. All
Professor,
right, so see you all again next Tuesday.
I have a question.